Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin Lemus, the founder and president of Gladeswise Youth Initiative. Today, I'm going to be joined by Gabriela Barreto as we sit down with a special guest to discuss a little bit more about environmental science. So please stay tuned and thank you for listening. So today we are here with Mr. Scott Erdmann, an AP Environmental Science and Marine Biology teacher at Ransom Everglades School.
Hello.
So first, can you tell us a little bit about your background and where you discovered that you wanted to learn about environmental science?
Sure. So I guess it probably started when we were kids growing up, my brothers and I. We grew up in kind of rural South Carolina, where it was pretty typical for us to go outside on a day after school or during the summer. And we kind of lived in a very woodsy area that had a local creek and stream that we would often go visit. And so our favorite thing was to go down and catch snakes and fish and all kinds of things down there. And so I think that kind of also was, I guess we also had a really good time when we would come to Florida to visit our grandparents who lived in Tampa at the time. And our favorite thing to do on vacation was to go down to the docks during low tide and see all the little organisms, crabs and clams and whatnot that you could find. And so that really kind of spurred us toward marine biology, I think. So I know, Caitlin, you're in my class. You probably are aware that I have an older brother who is also a marine biologist and who works, or used to work anyway, for Conservation International. And so he had a lot to do with it. And so, yeah, I guess as I got older, we would do things. He had a big influence on me. He, for instance, kept a lot of fish tanks and aquariums, and I like to kind of watch the fish and learn about them. And then as I got older, I got into the same hobby. We both went to Duke University and attended the Marine Lab as part of our education in the undergraduate. And he did it just a summer, but I spent a full semester there, and I just learned so much about um, the coastal estuary systems of North Carolina. I really enjoyed it. And then later on, after I graduated college, I actually went to visit him while he was doing his PhD work in Indonesia. Got an exposure to coral reefs that really got me hooked on that situation. So when it came time to choose a graduate school, I chose University of Hawaii, in part because they have nice reefs, or pretty nice reefs by U.S. standards anyway. So yeah, that's kind of what I got into. So then I kind of delved into animal behavior, but environmental science, if you do any kind of field biology, is always going to be something that you kind of learn about either passively or actively while you're out in the field. So yeah.
So you've talked a little bit about how your passion for environmental science and marine biology grew. So what brought you on the path specifically to becoming a teacher of these subjects?
Okay. Well, I think I've always considered teaching to be something I really enjoyed. I think going back to high school, when I consider probably some of my most important experiences as a student were in a field biology class at our school by a guy named Ed Saldo, who he taught this course where we basically would go outside every day. You'd go out and classify trees on the lot. This is in suburban Ohio. And you'd learn how to classify trees and insects. And so there were all kinds of, it was very project based, but all the time you were going outside, whether it was spring, summer, winter, and just kind of learning a lot about the local wildlife. So I definitely really enjoyed that. Your question was what got me into environmental science or teaching specific. Okay, so yeah, I think that had a big influence on me. I think teachers kind of, especially in secondary school, kind of have a big impact on the lives of students, and he's one such example. And I was fortunate to have some really good teachers at my high school. And so when it kind of came time to choosing between, in graduate school, usually you're kind of thinking along the lines of research, or like my brother got into conservation and policy. I was really drawn to teaching, and so when I had the opportunity I was on a research assistantship for a while, and I liked it, but I really enjoyed when I was a teaching assistant at the University of Hawaii for both marine biology and invertebrate zoology. And so I was basically the primary teacher for the lab sections. And I just had such a blast taking the kids outside, bringing the organisms back to lab, looking at them, that kind of thing. And it just really kind of set me down the path that that's what I wanted to do. So when it came time to choose, I was like, well, I mean, I could try to shoot for college, but Honestly, I felt like I would have more impact at the high school level, so that's kind of the path I chose. And I knew that if I wanted to kind of teach more marine biology, environmental sciencey kind of things that are maybe a little more elective style courses, I chose Ransom Everglades as or not Ransom specifically, but independent schools because you have that freedom. Some public schools are in good enough situation like Mast here in Miami that they can do some of those other programs, but a typical public school like marine biology, not really something you can teach. But I'm fortunate that at this school in particular, it's a subject that's obviously quite accessible with the bay right next to us.
So is that what made you choose Ransom specifically? Like when you were choosing where to teach, did you come to Miami and specifically Ransom because of that?
My first job was in New Orleans. And so when I got that job, I was hired to teach environmental science and biology. And I really enjoyed it. And there was a lot of great things about New Orleans, but honestly, that was mainly because that's where the job was. And I took kind of the first thing that came my way. When it came time to kind of being more picky and choosy as I had kind of gotten further into my career, I was looking to move to some place that was coastal, that had the possibility to teach marine biology. And the Ransom job opened up, and though initially it didn't have, I was mainly teaching an AP Bio, I noticed that they had a marine biology course and that the teacher was, I can't remember when she got her PhD, but she was clearly somebody who was close to retirement. I can tell she probably, and she's a great lady. Her name's Barbara Lester. She's a legend here, but she was definitely probably within 5 to 10 years of retirement. And sure enough, within about a couple of years, she had retired. And so I really wanted to take over the course, and so I was granted that opportunity. So, and then I've been teaching environmental science for about the same time we had another teacher retire. I wasn't really planning on necessarily teaching environmental science, but it was pretty fortuitous, and it was something I had taught in New Orleans before, so easy enough transition.
So our next question is, like, since you've lived in a few different places, like North Carolina, Ohio, Hawaii, Miami, what's one thing that you can connect throughout all those different places in terms of like the environmental risks that they're all facing? And if not the risks, then what's like one theme you see in like all the different places you've lived?
Sure. I mean, honestly, they're each different with their own problems. But they all have problems, right? You all see that, like, no matter where you go, even someplace like Hawaii that has relatively few people and is presumably like an island paradise, they still have issues. I remember within the first month I was there, I was on a drive with a student in the botany department who became a good friend of mine. And I'm just looking at this lush forest thing, like, wow, this is amazing. And it just kind of exploded. Like, I hadn't lived any place that was that densely forested as it is up in the mountains. And they're like, yeah, it's all invasive. So it's just like you think it's paradise, but it's actually being dominated by all these trees that had been let loose. And, a good chunk of them were not native to Hawaii. And then the longer I lived there, the more I realized that it wasn't just a terrestrial problem. It was happening underwater, too. There were invasive algae species, invasive fish species, this, that, and the other. I would say if you spend any time in marine sciences, I mean, obviously this isn't true of Ohio, but like North Carolina, here in Florida or Hawaii, you'll usually run into old timers who will have stories that are always like, it was so much better back when. And sure enough, I think most of those places I've lived, like if you look at photos, so like before and after, like for instance, the Hawaii Marine Lab in Kaneohe Bay, like if you looked at some of the old photos they had around the Marine Lab when it was first constructed, I mean, the coral cover was lush. There were fish everywhere. I mean, it really was like this awesome reef system. And they still have corals, and you can still do research there. But since we've had all these invasive species, and probably the most notable thing that had happened there was a sewer pipe had been constructed that was leading to eutrophication of the bay, you could definitely see that over the past couple decades there had been a pretty serious decline in coral cover, and there was a lot more algae, and the water was more turbid, and it was just kind of a sad story of what was once a lush reef slowly kind of going downhill. And then, as I mentioned, some of these other places like here in Florida, like Hawaii, maybe doesn't have the sea level issue, but that's definitely a problem here. That's definitely a massive problem in New Orleans, where not only do you have sea level rising, but you have land sinking. And so that really kind of became a focus of the curriculum. I just wanted those kids to know beyond just the AP curriculum, you guys are living in this area that's basically ground zero for the effects of climate change. And then, you could see, you talk to old timers who live in coastal Louisiana, there used to be a heck of a lot more marsh, and it's all kind of gone underwater now because of subsidence of the land combined with sea level rise. I mean, there's basically towns that don't exist on the coast now.
So everything's kind of like going underwater in a way.
A lot of it, yeah, and it's a complicated thing. A lot of it relates to what they've done with the Mississippi River and all the levees they've constructed. Yeah. The sediment that's supposed to build the land up now basically goes into the Gulf of Mexico, and so it's sinking under its own weight. So.
And I think I saw something of like Port Everglades and how there's going to be another kind of sediment plume around.
Yeah, I think they've already started construction. I haven't really read any data about I'm sure there's people out there looking at what's happening with the reefs, but it's probably going to be very similar to what happened in the Port of Miami, where you have local reefs that gets covered in sediment and will likely kind of take a nosedive for the foreseeable future. I mean, fortunately, it's not that large a scale operation that it's going to affect like all of South Florida, but certainly in those localities, you're going to see sedimentation being a big issue.
So you did kind of touch on this in your previous answer, but from when you began to study in this field to now, what are some of the biggest environmental changes that you've seen, I guess? I mean, you talked about some of the older people, I guess, in Hawaii, I think it was, were like, oh, it was so much better way back when. Mm-hmm. Like, is there anything like that for you yet that you've been able to identify?
Like, since I've been teaching, I'm trying to think if there's anything in particular that I've noticed. I mean, I would say, like, climate change is probably the one that I've seen a lot of changes in opinion, especially. I think the science continues to suggest that it's only getting warmer, that sea level is only rising, the ice caps are getting smaller. Like, there's been no change in the data as long as I've been teaching. What's interesting is I would have said when I first started, I remember one of my first job interviews, the actual environmental science teacher was kind of an old timer. He didn't believe in it, and he was kind of like questioning me whether, and honestly, my background's zoology. Their environmental science wasn't really a degree back in the day. Now it's more common, but I was aware of it, and I knew of a couple guys in oceanography that were certainly researching it and thought it was a real thing, but I hadn't really delved into the data. But when I started teaching, I actually did start looking up the scientific articles, and lo and behold, I mean, the data's there. It's undeniable. I would say the public perception has kind of gone back and forth. I would have said that 10 years ago, most students that I taught didn't take issue with the science. They were, how should I put it? They hadn't been propagandized to believe the other way. But I'm starting to see that belief in climate change in the discourse is now kind of going the other way again. And I think there's probably multiple factors for that, but I think one of the biggest ones is the fact that you now have things like AI that require massive amounts of energy, and nobody wants to talk about where that energy is going to come from. And whereas some of those Silicon Valley tech titans once upon a time were at least superficially concerned about the environment, now that they realize the mass energy use that's going to require, now all of a sudden they've kind of backed away from climate change and they don't want to talk about it anymore. And I think it's kind of like, it's this, as much as I don't, it was an okay movie, but I like the title of it. Al Gore put out a movie called An Inconvenient Truth.
Yes.
The title of it is absolutely true. It's like no one wants it to be true, but it's the reality. It's like there's going to be consequences from burning all those fossil fuels and putting that much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
And as a teacher, a lot of your students use AI, a lot of your fellow colleagues do as well. What do you think that your role in using AI would be? How would you educate your students on how to either use it responsibly or at least teach them about the risks that are associated with such a growing industry?
Right. I mean, I think it'll be interesting to kind of get into a discussion of environmental trade-offs because it's obviously going to become integrated into so many aspects of the economy, especially an information-based economy. I think the reality is it's here to stay. Just like once upon a time, when I first started teaching, Google had become the choice search engine, and now you could find so many things so rapidly. We're going to have to integrate AI into teaching at some point. Although it's evolving so rapidly, it's really hard to say exactly how yet, because I think as some of the things you're learning, like right now, it's kind of learning about how to prompt it, right? And I think, that's something you could maybe teach. But I think within 2 to 3 years, I don't even think prompting will be a skill. They're going to make the AI better at, they want to market it to people who, can use it easily and efficiently, like your grandma or whatever. And so I think it's going to become increasingly easy to use. And so with it comes, immense changes to the way we do things, but I don't know that you can put the brakes on the energy use. I think that's something that's very fascinating going forward is how are we going to power this? Because if everything moves to AI use, and it probably will, I'm sure it'll get somewhat efficient, but it's like at some point they may have to start charging for its use just so people aren't constantly using it for dumb stuff like cheating on my tests or whatever, or making silly cartoons or whatever it is they do with it nowadays. Because right now, obviously, it's free, so people use it, endlessly. They may start charging for its use, but even if they do that, I still think the energy question becomes important. So it's like when you look at our energy pie and you realize that renewables are such a small part of it, I don't know how quickly they can grow that. I mean, we may have to start considering more options like nuclear power, for example, that doesn't emit CO2, things like that. So, yeah, I don't know how they're going to tackle it, but it's something they have to definitely look at because it has a massive impact on kind of how we live and, if nothing else, just energy prices. I mean, you've probably already heard there's been struggles where people see their, it's supply and demand. If a data center moves next to you and it starts sucking all the power, then you're paying more for it. How do you accommodate that?
Like not only with the data centers, I think I saw this graphic that was like the AI industry used as much energy as New York City in 1 year, and it used as much water as the whole water bottle industry in a year. So with like the mix of rising sea levels that would kind of threaten our freshwater sources and the increased use of AI, what do you think? If you know anything about like the cooling of AI, how do you think that we're going to be able to manage that, like government-wise? I know we've talked a little bit about policy in class.
I mean, do you mean accommodating sea level rise specifically or
like
energy use?
The trade-off between, you were speaking about it a little bit earlier, but the trade-off between like not having enough water to drink because of sea level rise and then increasing our demand exponentially because of AI.
Well, I mean, they're related issues, but I mean, like first of all, there's just the raw energy use, which has to come from somewhere. Like I said, this gets into kind of deeper questions about growth and economies. It's like one of the kind of crazy things you have to consider is like pretty much everybody who's invested, and that would include most people, like even teachers with 401ks. Like the idea is we just sort of assume an economy of infinite growth, right? Like I can't retire unless there's economic growth, right? Because that's how my stocks and bonds get bigger, right? But what if we reach a place where there's just not enough energy and you don't get the growth? And what does that mean? I mean, that's basically talking about like economic collapse. I mean, that would be very, very serious for a lot of investors. And as such, I think they're going to, relentlessly push energy. But at what cost? Like I said, there's some options that don't release CO2, like nuclear, like renewables, but I don't know that they can scale it fast enough. So if we just start going whole hog into coal, oil, natural gas, of which there's still plenty left, what does that mean for climate change and sea level rise? And that's something that I think we have to reckon with. I mean, if you live on the coast in a place like Miami Beach, you really have to consider, is this where you're going to try to, basically have a legacy and have a place you want to be for the next 100 years or whatever? I think if you're just kind of renting and transient, maybe you don't care. But I think if you are actually concerned you consider South Florida your home, you really do need to think about what that means in the future and how you're going to deal with it. And I don't think most South Floridians have really thought about that very hard.
Yeah. It kind of goes with like that changing attitude that you mentioned in terms of people kind of now starting to negate some of the climate science, and then you add the fact that they're not believing it with the fact that it's only going to get worse from here. In Gladeswise, we do a lot with like conservation and sustainability. So we're kind of focused on the fact that we're losing so much land, like 2,000 acres of farmland a day, to like development, AI, all these different factors. But then also you add in the fact that like renewable energy, wind turbines, solar, they take up so much space. So along with the fact that you have so much of it that's needed for economic growth, in terms of conservation and sustainability, what do you think can be put in place policy-wise in order to prevent further environmental degradation?
You're talking about land conservation in particular,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, policy-wise, it's tough because you're oftentimes these are things that honestly are more driven by consumer choice as much as anything. So as you guys learned in your class with the whole 10% rule, we have a vast amount of our land base that's dedicated to growing things like corn that then goes to feed cows. And then when you consider then this principle of thermodynamics, it basically says 90% of that energy is lost when you feed it to a cow. You're basically wasting 90% of your land base. The solution, honestly, if you're mainly concerned about land, is getting people to eat more lower on the food chain, if you will. So, a more plant-based diet is typically the way to go to get the best bang for your buck out of your land. But it's hard to convince people especially if you've grown up eating meat, like how you do that. There's a lot of issues, especially with cows, that have to do with, they're of all the primary consumers, they're probably the worst in terms of their energy conversion. Chicken and fish are considerably better. So if you are going to be a meatitarian, it's probably better to shift toward a diet like that. But again, it's like having a government tell you have to eat fish or chicken, or of course the meme now is like eat the bugs, right? Like I wouldn't suggest eating bugs necessarily, but the idea is like, how do you convince people to either eat more vegetable matter or to eat the more sustainable choices for meat? And it's difficult in a country like America to just say, hey, this is the law, you have to eat this. I mean, you can tax it, I suppose, but again, you're running into major resistance, I think, if you do that. And of course, the other problem is the agricultural sector has massive lobbying power, so all those companies that produce the beef and the pork, they're not going to be too pleased with that. So I don't think it's an easy ship to steer, but I think as you start to see problems with the land base being, used up, I think it's eventually you'll start to see it just out of necessity, it'll start to have to happen. But I think we're probably a long ways here in the United States. We have a lot of land still. I think you probably see that kind of thing happen in smaller countries before here, but it's definitely something that I could see being a big problem in the future because our population's only getting bigger.
In your answer, you talked about, you mentioned like people, when the government tells you to eat this or whatever, people are more inclined to be like, well, maybe no, this is propaganda, I don't want to kind of do it.
Sure.
So there's a point to this, I promise, but South Park did an episode about Al Gore, and they kind of made fun of him for his climate change stuff.
The Man Bear Pig episode?
Yes, and then I guess a year later, I think it was, they did like an apology episode, which is the first time they've ever like done one.
No.
So, because it was the same thing that they felt, like politicians telling them this, like, well, maybe that's not true. So when people want to get more educated about, I guess, climate change in particular, like, where can they go to get accurate information they know is not maybe touched by a lot of bias?
Ooh, that's a tough question. So, how should I put it? What I've always told my kids to go, and this is hard because navigating the sources you have on the internet especially can be tricky. I remember when I first started teaching, climate change was a hot topic, and I had kids look at a couple websites. And for example, the government website, which is where you probably find the most accurate data, NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, at the time had something that looked like it was a GeoCities webpage, and you guys probably don't get that reference, but it's like basically very low-tech website, not slick looking at all. I mean, it had the data and everything, but it was not nearly as well developed as some of the other websites that were effectively put out by fossil fuel lobbyists. So you go to these fossil fuel web pages that tell you climate change is real, this, that, and the other, and climate skeptics putting it out. They had a very slick website design, very professional looking. You have to go digging to see who put it out, and then you finally get to who wrote the website. It's like, oh, it's all these guys in the fossil fuel industry. It's like, oh, that's so that they have an agenda. And that can be hard because most people don't want to take the time to figure out who's actually putting the information out there. They just see it, or even with AI, I don't even know if AI is capable of necessarily sorting out like misinformation in some cases. Hopefully it's trained to look at data and science and peer-reviewed publications, but I honestly don't know what it does for that kind of thing, or how it prioritizes like people's opinions when they write that kind of thing. But yeah, like I would say typically, and it doesn't matter whether or not you agree with the current administration or former administrations, I would say, the government websites are pretty good. They're usually run by scientists who, yes, they do get funding from various places, but generally speaking, they're working for the public good. So I don't think they're BSing you when they give you information about carbon dioxide or temperature or whatever. All that stuff is stuff that's funded and the data's available. I would say, what you learn in school is important too. I think one of the things that education has kind of done is we've put a lot of emphasis on STEM, but we always kind of put it on the big three: biology, chemistry, physics, which I still think are very important, and they're certainly relevant to environmental science. But I'm aware of a number of schools now that are trying to push environmental science as a required class, especially for like 9th grade, which in my opinion makes a lot of sense. Like, this is something that's directly relevant. I think there's a lot of things in biology that you guys learn that you probably won't remember much about years from now, like osmosis or whatever. And it's like, these are the kinds of things that I think as a educated citizen, you really ought to know whether you choose a STEM field or not. And so that's maybe something we might see in the future, is a lot more environmental science as part of education, so that people are much more aware of these things that are becoming increasingly problematic.
When it comes to like what individuals can do to help protect the environment, or at least make a positive impact, what do you think are some of the most important things that they should be doing?
It's the old kind of, think globally, act locally kind of thing. I think sometimes it can get very depressing and feel overwhelmed with these massive existential issues like climate change. It's like, your personal carbon footprint is just a very, very tiny drop in the bucket. So it could be like, well, even if I, do my best to conserve energy, et cetera, what's that going to do? But the thing is like, if everybody takes that mindset, it's going to be very difficult to fix a lot of these very serious problems. And you can't just bank on a government making rules. Like, it really does have to, it requires kind of a grassroots effort. I would say in particular, we mentioned food before. That's one of the big ones. Understanding your diet and its consequences on the environment. I mean, I still eat meat, I'll be honest, but I eat a lot less of it since teaching environmental science. That's also true of Dr. Stump, my colleague. I don't think she's vegetarian quite yet, but she definitely has phased out red meat. Yeah, actually she won't eat fish, she doesn't like it, but if they put bacon in the thing, she'll eat it because she's drawn to bacon, but otherwise for her own, like if it's up to her, she will not usually eat meat with a typical meal. And again, that's primarily a consequence of being educated on the matter. It's not about like animal rights kind of thing, it's more just understanding the environmental consequences. Same thing with, like recycling, for example. I see around my neighborhood, some people do, some people don't. Some people throw their trash in the recycling bin. It's kind of just, making a point of being educated about it, realizing that it's a problem. You mentioned something about media. I think media can do a better job of highlighting a lot of these problems that we learn about in class. Oftentimes they're kind of back page issues. They're not the headliner issues that you see. And we kind of need to do a better job of helping citizens understand that all these problems that are around us are only getting worse, and if you don't take some kind of action, nothing's going to change. So, yeah, I mean, you don't, like, I often tell students that get bummed out, like, you don't have, it's not always a black and white decision. You don't have to become a hardcore vegan who thrift shops all their clothing and recycles literally everything and has zero I mean, that's great if you do, but the more things you do, the better. So I would just say even small changes, they add up. The more people that kind of follow the good principles, you find that, collectively that can have a.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yay.